today we have myself and Yvonne as co-editors with Emil and Anna Greer for the special issue on Posthuman Legalities with the Journal of Human Rights and the Environment. We're very happy to have Marie Catherine Peterson here, who is one of the contributors to the special issue. And she'll be talking about her chapter in a little bit. And I also see that Pam Aldred is here, who is also one of the contributors to the special issue. Regrettably, many of the contributors are in Australia, and it is 4:30 in the morning there, so they won't be able to join us. We thought we'd start by just sort of introducing the genesis of how this special issue came to be. It was a bit of a strange and developing process. It actually came out of a class in the Leadership for the Ecozoic program that we took, where we had to write papers on our sort of subfields that we had been grouped into. So mine was ontology and ethics, and Yvonne and Emil's was law and governance. And fortuitously, Yvonne and Emil were writing a paper together, and then that sort of, there were commitments that made that paper not be able to be finished. So I jumped in as an environmental anthropologist and wrote it with Emil. And that was my first foray into the area of ecological law. So it was a big learning curve for me. But I think Emil and I's co-writing produced sort of interesting transdisciplinary work, and it ended up in a paper that was published in Transnational Environmental Law called Steps Towards an Legal Ontological Turn. And while we were doing that, we thought with Yvonne that we should, because there seemed to be real interest in pushing ecological law even further than it's already come. Even it's quite a nascent and rapidly developing field. And we wanted to, people seemed really interested in maybe radicalizing, let's say, the discussion, putting it further in conversation with legal anthropology, Indigenous legal theory, and so on. So we had decided to organize a conference on the subject. And regrettably, this was in 2019, early 2019. And as we were putting together this conference and inviting people and getting funding and all of this, the thing that happened that we're all very, very intimately aware of happened, and we had to cancel the conference. And so we decided, instead of, this was quite early in the pandemic, so instead of trying to shift gears towards an online conference, that we would instead draw on that same community of scholars that we had been drawing on for the conference to maybe produce a special issue. And we pitched it to Anna Greer, the Journal of Human Rights and the Environment. And a bit surprisingly, she immediately basically said yes. They had been already thinking about or planning a special issue on new materialist interventions into law, ecological and environmental law. So it dovetailed quite nicely what we were thinking with what they had already been planning. So then we started, trying to get papers, reaching out to scholars, and through the long process, as many of you know, creating a special issue, we were able to put out this issue, I think, which is quite a diverse issue of contributions from varying perspectives, some of which are more influenced by new materialist thinking, some of which is more influenced by posthuman thinking, some of which is more anthropological, a sort of wide array of interventions and contributions to furthering the discussion on what a posthuman law might mean. And so I think in the end we had 8 contributions from scholars from Europe, Australia, North America, and I think we're quite proud of it. And it was quite a learning process. It was really engaging, and I think Yvonne, Emil, and myself and I, who had never edited a journal issue before, we learned a lot about the backside, let's say, of journal processes, and you know, how to navigate, edit, you know, adjudicate. So it was really a learning experience for all of us, and I think especially across our disciplines. Emil is a lawyer by training and legal scholar. Yvonne is also a legal scholar, and he's described himself to me as a wannabe anthropologist at times. And I'm an environmental anthropologist, so there was a good array of scholarly background to draw upon for this kind of topic. So maybe I'll pass it to you, Yvonne, now, and you can put in your sense.
Of course. Well, first of all, thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today. We are very excited to be able to share this collaboration with you. Very excited with the contributions, also with the presence of one of the contributors to this special edition, Marie Persman. Thank you very much for joining us. And also, I wanted to offer a few thoughts on how this project is connected to a general interest in our program.
Shall I pick up Yvonne's thought while we wait for him? I think what he's gesturing towards is our program, which all 3 of us, Emil, Yvonne, and myself are students in, though Yvonne is now a graduate and postdoc with the program now, is really attempting to move beyond the conditions of the Anthropocene that produce the Anthropocene, and that, you know, the academy continues to train people in the disciplines as they are, which continue to produce Anthropocene conditions. So the program is really oriented towards rethinking on a basic fundamental levels, from epistemology, ontology, law, governance, ethics, the place of the human in the larger meshwork of relations that make up the ecological world. And so the theme of this special issue is really in line with that thrust, trying to apply that rethinking and that intervention specifically to what law might mean, broadly conceived, in a world that's both beyond the sort of modernist conception of the human as a bounded, both a bounded subject individually, but also like as a bounded community, insulated from natural processes. And further, one of the things that we were really trying to think through in this issue is what might law mean when law isn't only the production of norms with their basis in that exclusive human community. What can law mean when it might have its origins beyond the human circle? Is there a way to think through and put in conversation sort of contemporary turns in Western legal thinking and ecological law, to put into conversation with other forms of law, largely indigenous forms of law that are well aware of and, you know, have long, for millennia, engaged in legal orders that have their origins, their constitutions, their bases in a world beyond the human circle, taking norms not produced purely from the imagination, let's say, of human subjects, but from the world in which we're all enmeshed. So I'll pass it back to Yvonne now that he's here.
Sorry, I don't know what happened. Something with my system updating itself, both metaphorically and literally. So anyhow, so I was trying to kind of contextualize the objective of this book, which is in a way contributing to a larger transformation in law, in legal theory, and also in environmental law in particular. And I was saying that our program, L4E, has also this orientation, in a sense, is to rethink disciplines for a moment of transition. And within that interest, we have here with us today also Jeff Garver, who's been a very important voice in this movement towards rethinking legal institutions, in particular environmental law. And kind of one of the main tenets of this transition, this transformation, is to rethink the ontological presuppositions of law, which is one of them is that law is based on an assumption that humans and non-humans are separate, which is a modern assumption through which everything is organized in life, both in theory and action. So in a way, one of the kind of interventions, if you will, of interest is joining kind of a long-standing effort to rethink this ontology of separation in a way, and in law in particular. So ecological law is one of these efforts, but also something that we are calling a law beyond the human. And a law beyond the human is it's based on the idea that law is not something that happens only in human cultures, that if we expand the notion of law to include other beings and include relationships, that necessarily implies to open up conceptually and practically what we mean by law in our cultures, and kind of to face modern, and with a very practical interest. And the problems that we are facing today require different kinds of institutions and thought systems. So in a way, a law beyond the human is taking a radical stance on the idea that non-humans are agents, are social agents of sorts. And if we think of law as a social institution, then that also requires to take a very critical stance on the idea that things like territories and rivers are not only objects of protection, but also subjects of their own protection, subjects of rights, subjects of what we call legal meaning. So this is sort of a larger, kind of a very overarching scope of this project, and many of the contributions speak from different vantage points to this larger idea that non-humans and humans are connected, and that should also put us in a kind of a open space for a different conceptualization and practice of law, of which Rise of Nature is just one instance. So I'm just gonna take a couple of minutes to read a short piece that sort of put together some of these ideas, and that it's in a way sort of summarize my vision on what this project is about. So as we know, climate change and COVID-19 have revealed the limited response capacity of conventional environmental law and governance models that, as we know, insist on this separation between law, society, and earth systems of sorts. So what we believe this collection is doing is offering sort of contributing to a paradigm shift that is based on, first, epistemic plurality, second, relational thinking, and third, which is lesser developed in the book, a decolonial praxis in creating legal institutions, right? So one of the questions that we pose there is, how are, for example, indigenous cosmologies and their legal systems contributing to this larger paradigm shift in law more broadly? So in a way, how indigenous legal traditions, ways of thinking, ways of being are transforming what we mean by law more broadly. So, and connected to that, what kind of theoretical and especially methodological tools does this sort of earth-oriented law offer us today? And as I said, beyond this idea of the Rise of Nature approach, then the question that we want to ask in this book is, how does a law that is entangled with local territorial practices, that is entangled with posthumans, as one of the authors conceptualized this, challenge anthropocentric and colonial concepts of justice, first of all, agency, and also value in times of socio-ecological transitions. How connected to that do humans and other than humans, for example, soils, for example, one of the contributors talks about transitional justice and soil, for example, co-produce protocols for territorial governance. So in a way, this contribution, this special edition is trying to produce a novel intersection between indigenous legal epistemologies, an evolving movement that has been named in different ways: earth jurisprudence, earth law, ecological law, although there are important nuances, posthumanist theory, including anthropological contributions to that idea. So in a way, our book it's offering some ideas, sharing some ideas to answer these larger questions. So I'm gonna leave it there because the idea also is to open space for us to talk about these ideas, to have a more of a conversation rather than us just speaking. So I'm gonna pass it on to Marie, one of our contributors, who is going to talk about her chapter. So Marie, the floor is yours, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Ivan, and thanks also to Joshua and to Emile. I'm sorry I couldn't. I mean, I missed the opportunity to meet her, but I'm very pleased to be with you tonight. I mean, for my night standards, and perhaps just jumping in the discussion that you triggered now, I might just start with the broader research project that I'm currently working on before zooming into this specific contribution, because it's much more narrow than actually the work that I'm interested in and doing at the moment, and it resonates a lot with these different questions and orientations that you put forward now in your presentation, Ivan. And I suppose, and this is also something I would love to discuss then in the general discussion. You spoke about non-human agency, relationality, and you also spoke about subjectivity, the turns to rights of nature. And I guess building a bit on all these different insights and critique, what I'm particularly interested in my current work, and which I would really love to discuss with you all, is really try to even push. This is a bit what I see. So I'm trained as an international environmental lawyer, and I see that in my field, at least, the turn to rights of nature and to subjectivity and personhood of non-humans, this is a bit the most progressive agenda in the field in many ways. And what I find, of course, interesting is that it brings in the questions that you raise now on justice, agency of non-humans, etc. But where I want to push this agenda further is really that how can we think beyond this notion of subjectivity that really is reinscribed with the turn to rights of nature. So in my work, I try to really start with the question of not necessarily non-human agency, but really the agency of the relation between living entities and also non-living entities. And so really start with the entanglement, with the relationality and the agency of this relation, by moving beyond basically a reinscription of the subject-object dichotomy. And I see that the move in the rights of nature by turning non-humans into subjects of law is not pushing it's not pushing us far enough, because we are still stuck with the subject. And in my current work, I'm very much thinking about overcoming this notion of subjectivity, of being a subject, even when it is, let's say, expanded to non-humans, because it's precisely this category of the subject that is really that emerged through modernist onto epistemologies that I try to overcome in my current research. And for that, I'm very much inspired by theoretical strands on critical Black studies that really move beyond the process of individuation that is necessary in the enactment or the thinking of subjects, let's say. So this is a bit the direction of the discussion that I would love to invite you all to in a moment. But perhaps just to say a couple of words about the specific chapter that I wrote for the special issue or for the book. So in this chapter, I'm trying to rethink two really key doctrines of international environmental law: the doctrine of responsibility on the one hand, and the doctrine of protection or environmental protection in international environmental law. And I do this in light of notions of responsibility as developed by Donna Haraway on the one hand, and speculative ethics of care as developed by Puig de la Bella Casa on the other hand. And this, of course, against the backdrop of more than human world. And we can come back to a bit how I see the position of subjects in more than human world. And so what I must say is really the underlying logic of international environmental law. And I try to challenge this underlying logic by, let's say, fighting a bit the urge to offer doctrinal fixes or to reform international environmental law, but really use it a bit as a notion to rethink key doctrines in a very explorative mode. So I juxtapose Haraway's call to cultivate a responsibility as one way of collective knowing and doing, and Barad's agential realist form of responsible interaction. So here is the notion of entanglement that comes into the game with, again, this ideal of responsibility in international environmental law and the normative trope that is restricted, let's say, by the conceptual and the material coordinates of state sovereignty, of territorial jurisdictions, of strict liability, of always the individuated, either the state or the subject of harm, etc. And so I guess the starting diagnosis is that under international environmental law and international law more broadly, a state is always responsible internationally for a wrongful act that is attributed to the state, and this responsibility is then, of course, unfolding in a very specific and delimited jurisdiction. So I try to then rethink these notions by thinking the notions of spatiality, temporality, subjectivity, and causality. So with regards to spatiality and the international law, again, states, as we know, are always, the actions of states are always delimited to territorial jurisdictions that are already predetermined, prefixed. Very often the origins of state delimitation is rooted, as we know, in colonial and imperial legacies. And basically, what I find interesting here and what I have been inspired in my work is the turn to materiality and geography, and thinking about flows, about flows of energy, of matter. I've very much been inspired by the work of Peter Pigetti. Maybe some of you know him. He's a Canadian scholar as well, who thinks about ecological law following cycles of biogeochemical cycles. So this is really a bit thinking about notions of the milieu, let's say, not through a theoretical, a territorial theorization, but really addressing a bit the non-static, the vertical, the volumetric qualities of really terrestrial space and all the vitality that comes with it. And when it comes to the question of temporality, what I find very limiting with the notion of state responsibility beyond this sort of spatial delimitation is that we are very much confined in international environmental law to establishing specific harms with always a link between a sort of linear temporality between a cause and an effect. And this temporality, this linear temporality, is then very much one that is grounded again in a notion of near future or tangible past. And what I find interesting when we think about critical Anthropocene studies is, let's say, the conflicting temporality that are open up when we try to think about geological deep time on the one hand, and temporalities of politics and social formations that are, of course, much more short-sighted, let's say. So again, the idea always being to move beyond the sort of how can we envision law, legalities, legal imagination beyond these delimitations, and also with regards to time, how can we develop a sense of accountability or responsibility to harms, let's say, that are not graspable through the regime of temporality that, let's say, in modernist traditions are very much focused on presentive regimes of temporality. And then, of course, the question of subjectivity is how can we rethink questions of state responsibility, but also non-state responsibility beyond, again, the traditional subjects of international law, whether the state, the non-state actors like corporations, but always, again, very much an anthropocentric grounding, focusing on humans, and even in the turn to environmental protection and the responsibility to protect the non-humans, we are again always working with a very predefined understanding of the subjects that ought to be protected, or for which states and non-state actors ought to be responsible. We are again in a sort of delimitation and a process of individuation, etc. And again, this backdrop, I then work with Donna Haraway's notion of responsibility, or the ability to respond, where accountabilities are extensive and always unfinished. Donna Haraway also works with notions of ongoingness, and she proposes an ecology of that is inspired again by feminist ethics, where questions of species differentiation are always again conjugated with attention to affect, to entanglement, and again moving a bit beyond the cuts, the modernist cuts and divides that are performed, let's say, in let's say traditional understandings of international environmental law, state responsibility, and the protection of the environment. And so I combine a bit this sort of opening of the notion of responsibilities and the fact that there are always differential vulnerabilities, differential accountabilities that are very much determined by the abilities of the different actors to respond to certain harms. And these harms can be material, immaterial, can be visible, invisible, can be have already materially occurred, can be really almost also opening up questions of spirituality, of different cosmologies, let's say, that are not sensible, that are not perceptible as such. And in a similar way, and I will, this is just the second point that I work through in the chapter, I try to juxtapose then the question of the protection of the environment through Maria Puig de la Bella Casa notions of care, where again, moving beyond the sense of delimitation of protecting either certain ecosystems or certain subjects or certain, again, individuated processes, to really think about care as an opening, effective mode of engaging with the other, let's say, and where it is exactly this engagement with, this acting with, this thinking with, this feeling with instead of feeling for, that always determines already an object of care. So really being open to this notion of caring with. And here again, I try to think about Maria Puig de la Bella Casa's notion of matters of care, which she sees as a translation into a fixed explanatory vision of a normative sense, so not a moral or epistemological, but really a speculative ethical commitment to know modes of knowing, of caring, that are really aimed at re-affecting objectified worlds and keeping this sense of care, this engagement open, really trying to work against the enclosure, the fixing, the cuts, and working generatively through this process, this open process and ongoing process of generative care. And again, the sense of care can be opens up, let's say, different modes of thinking about engaging with active modern human worlds in beyond a bit the modernist cuts of spatial, temporal, subjective, and causal delimitations or continuities or discontinuities. And I find that very productive again so what I'm suggesting, of course, is not to rethink the doctrine of state responsibility for environmental protection through what I'm trying to explore through notions of responsibilities of care for more than human worlds, but rather show through these post-humanist, new materialist, and decolonial theoretical strands how basically the very key coordinates of the field of international environmental law, questions of responsibility and protection of a very delimited and specific environment, are complicated and problematized through these doctrines or notions of responsibilities and care. And I think that this really is very generative and productive in opening novel imaginations or legal imaginaries and possible new modes of engaging again with the legal commitments of the field of international environmental law. So these are the main arguments I present in the chapter, and I'd love to hear your thoughts or have a more general discussion.
Well, Marie, thank you so very much for your intervention and for this overview of your contribution to this volume. And also, I wanted to acknowledge here also the presence of another of our co-authors, contributors to this special edition, Pam Aldred. Actually, well, today, this is also an opportunity to meet Marie and Pam. We haven't had the chance to have a different interaction rather than, email exchanges. So this is also a way in which we are all building community and relationships. If we are talking about relationships, it cannot be limited to the screen, right? Although, well, this is the world we live in, but at least we can put a face on the paper. I think that's also on that note, Pam, if you want to join us and offer a few ideas about your contribution or about this conversation, you're very welcome to do so at this time. If not, we can generally open the space for folks to talk a bit about questions that you might have for Marie or for the authors, the co-editors. Okay, I think we lost Pam there, but while she reconnects, I wanted to also point out to something that Marie was hinting at, and it's this notion of legal imagination. And I think one of the big important challenges, both methodological and theoretical, is how we can connect, we can bridge a gap between legal imagination that can be quite wild. I mean, we can go conceptually, we can go many places, and the very practicalities of today's world and legal institutions. So in a way, how can this ontological dimension that we are trying to build here together can be put into work? Can be put into work in particular adjudicating scenarios, particular land claims from concrete communities in the ground, educational. So it's a challenge at many different levels, and it's also a challenge of bridging legal imagination at the level of concepts with the very practicalities of an everyday legal practice that has a different kind of challenges. So that's something kind of, and I wanted to also take it because I realized that we didn't present the volume properly, and I think I'm going to take a few minutes to present the way in which we have organized this volume So you get a sense of what kind of contributions are put here and the challenges ahead. And we can talk about the challenges after we have a little bit of a discussion, but just allow me to say a few words about how this volume is organized. So we basically have organized the volume around 3 axes. One that we called posthumanist and new materialist legal theory, which is the idea that we need a legal theory that is attuned with this notion of the posthuman. So the idea that the human should be replaced, decentered, and repositioned within a larger meshwork of cosmological relationships. So that first axis kind of speaks to that repositioning, decentering the modern human and repositioning a human that is entangled with other fellow living members of cosmos. So the other has to do more specifically to the idea of modern human international law, the notion that international law being so important in the development of the rights of nature doctrine can also be post-humanized in a very particular sense, dehumanized from a notion of a human that is modern-centered, and post-humanized with this notion of a human that is entangled with other forms of life. So, so one axis, just to summarize, has to do with legal theory. The other has to do with international law, in particular, the developments of the rights of nature in the context of international law. And the third one that it speaks directly to the topics that Marie was speaking about has to do with this notion of environmental responsibility, the ability to respond to the challenges of environmental decline. And there we have a sort of different contributions also from the arts, from the visual arts and from other disciplines to talk about how justice can be enacted differently, how we can respond to the challenges of today's crisis with this notion of enhancing, potentiating our ability to respond. So that's in a way the way in which Marie and this of course opens a question of how we can do that, and there are a series of challenges that we can talk about later. I don't know if Josh wanna add something on the thread that we are building here somewhat in a very kind of jazzy improvisational mode. Hopefully it resonates with you all, but the floor is yours, Josh.
Thanks, Yvonne, for more formally introducing the special issue. Perhaps maybe I'll just say a few things responding to what Maria and you were just talking about, and then we can just open it to the wider floor. So I'm presently out here at my field site for my ethnographic research. And one of the things that is really coming to mind is, as Marie was speaking, is the sort of dual gesture in the title of the special issue in relation to posthuman, right? It both gestures towards the world beyond the human, but it also gestures towards a different conception of the human. And what many of the people, or that's required to be able to respond, right, to become sensible to that wider field of relations, and what many of the people here at my field site are doing is particularly that they're trying to sort of transform themselves, and in their terms would be like broaden their awareness, right, and build their connections and deepen their ability to relate beyond the human. And this is the kind of thing that's very difficult for law to get a grasp upon, right? To be legible to law, the kinds of human beings or the kind of developments in the internal world, in the sensible world, in the spiritual world of human beings that may be required to relate beyond the human with beings that are sort of exiled from modernist ontology, right? To be able to for agential selves beyond those instantiated in human bodies to be relatable to be even seen in the first place. And you can see this right in the rights of nature, the reinscription often of a particular type, like you were speaking about, Marie, a particular type of human subjectivity being broadened beyond or inscribed beyond the human. And it becomes quite clear that this is not easily applicable to things like rivers and river valleys, right, which are often, you know, like in the Wanganui case, include the entire watershed, include specifically in the terminology of the case, the metaphysical elements of the river. And these are not things that modernist legal theory is exceptionally conversant in, and seems to be, to me, I don't know what you think, Marie, but many of these subjects that are sort of conjured into existence by our environmental, our most progressive environmental legal orders are really empty subjects. They don't really relate to selves. They're impositions in a way, they're inscriptions, attempting to capture something beyond the human, but not really responding to that which is beyond the human. I'm not letting it, let's say, that selfhood to arise beyond the human and, you know, participate and relate and present itself, rather than be sort of inscribed in a juridical person that is the production of a particular Western legal heritage and metaphysical heritage. So that, I mean, those were the thoughts that were coming to mind as you were speaking, as I'm engaging with all of these people trying to expand their awareness beyond the human. So maybe we can just open it up there to the wider, maybe Marie, you can speak to that, and then anyone who wants to
I don't want to take any more time, but just before opening, just to, in 1 second, I'm totally with you, and I think you put the words really right about flow and metaphysical. I mean, this is precisely what I'm after, and my question when I'm trying to think beyond the subject, let's say, of the river, is precisely trying to understand how we can engage in meaningful ways with this ecosystem by moving beyond the sort of delimitation that comes with recognizing the river as a subject. Even when we try to recognize the flow, the metaphysical, basically the question boils down to, where does the river start? Where does the river end? You know, and what I mean, I believe that this sort of drive it's precisely the modernist cut that comes with the definition of a subject of protection that I'm trying to work against.
Yeah, so maybe if anyone has any questions, you can raise your digital hand or put it in the chat. I don't know if anything's come to mind while we've been speaking. Well, there we go. I expected, Jeff.
You know what? Hello, everybody. This is really interesting. I'm so impressed by your book. So I've read the editorial, you know, the front section, and you know, it's a little intimidating to me, actually. I mean, it's just it's powerful. It blows my mind, literally. And so I'm going to be doing some digesting, but you know, it brings to mind a few ideas that I've been thinking about. So one idea I had in my work on ecological law is this idea of not just trying to give personhood to nature or to elements of nature, but also to try to give naturehood to people in the law. And I find that interesting because we have no idea what that means, right? It's not a legal term, and yet it's an interesting challenge to me. And then I realized through some conversations in Elfery, in the anthropological setting it's in, I said, well, you know, a lot of indigenous people or communities around the world don't think of people as only humans. So this is really then becomes a Western law focused idea. You know, personhood in the Whanganui River, as I understand it, extends to the river and all elements of it. And this is an idea of, a couple thoughts on that. I mean, I think naturehood, as I'm thinking of it and what I'm learning from you, really brings in this idea of relationality and co-evolution of place and space and so on, mutuality, reciprocity, interdependence, and so things that are missed in the static way that much of law and environmental law treats the environment and elements of it. And the sort of question that all of that leads me to, and I hope the connection is clear, is to what extent does decision-making that has to happen in human communities transcend humans in these post-human legalities? So presumably you have human communities that continue within whatever framework. There are conversations that are going to be mostly among humans, even if they're formed by relationships with other persons, non-human persons. But there are individual and collective decision-making that will continue to go on in human communities. And it's sort of like, it's kind of asking what part of how does decision-making change with post-human legalities within these communities? Or how does this normativity that is much more fluid, much more connected to the non-human world, what element of that is within the human community? And I ask it with this idea of taking these ideas and linking them to practice and where we are, what the situation in the world is now, to try to get a feeling of how does this work affect how we will make decisions differently in a transformative way within individual or within human collectives within the this broader idea of connection of humans and non-humans. I hope that was clear, but yeah.
Your hand, Yvonne.
Yeah, unless somebody else wanted to jump in first. I mean, this is an ongoing conversation, and part of we are very cautious in the editorial in signaling that there are to this theoretical conceptual interest of expanding the law or kind of engaging with this ontological dimension of law. There are many challenges, and we have identified several challenges. One of them is that is presently in law, but also in culture in general, an over-reliance on human representation, human language, the idea that human representation is the conduit for the law in a way. So, which speaks to an idea of law that is defined as a system of normative claims. What this book is trying to do is kind of challenge this kind of pre-analytical presupposition that the law is norms, or that the law is a set of propositional language. We are saying that however, the law can also be defined in a more non-symbolic system that comprises ecological relationships, lived experience, artifacts, so that things like land is the source of law can have room in the legal conversation in a very serious way. And not just like a cultural idea of some groups somewhere in the Amazon or in Australia or in the boreal forests of Canada. So what we are saying is that insofar as law, it cannot be reduced only to its propositional expression, nor to this normative expression, then there are other ways of expanding the law beyond this representational register in a way. So that's one point, and that's one, at the same time, one challenge. The second challenge that we identify in this in our special edition is that of the methodological implications of this. So if law is beyond representation, if we can talk of a non-representational law that includes dreams, that includes what anthropologists call ritual, that includes the land itself, then what are the methodologies and the methodological implications for this, both in legal thinking, but also in adjudicational scenarios, and also in legal scenarios. So basically, what we are trying to hint at with this special edition is that more than human beings, or human beings on human beings, open up the possibility of another perception of the law, not as something that is necessarily exterior to society, exterior to humans, embedded in society, but something that is of the realm of relationships and of shared materiality, for example. So the question, what are the methodologies to do that? And we can just, there are several examples that we can bring into this. If one methodology of law, for example, in a trial, is bringing a expert witness to talk about their expertise to solve a legal issue, well, happens that we already have it in the international law doctrine of the rights of nature that, for example, recently in International Court of the Commission of Human Rights brought as expert witness an elder to talk on behalf.
A second update.
Okay. Well, I'll just pick up where he was talking. One of the things, yeah, I mean.
Please, Josh, pick up because okay.
Oh, you're back.
Sorry, my internet is not cooperating. So just I'm gonna leave it there. I don't want to take too much space. So two challenges that we identify. One, representation is not the only way. There are other ways, and we have countless examples of that all over the world in indigenous communities doing law in this very way, making decisions in this way, drawing on dreams to make decisions and create protocols. So that happens, and it's a direct challenge to Western institutions. Second, that in the West, that it poses a methodological challenge. How do we do this? So those are the two challenges that we have identified in our book, but there are many others. Okay, sorry, Colin. Yes, please go ahead.
Can I just pick up for a moment before we go to
yes, Josh and Colin.
What these challenges force us to encounter is that for law to really be sensible to a world beyond the human, for it to really engage and not empty lip service to imagined beings, not real beings, but sort of, constructed beings beyond the human. It requires a whole set of new methodologies, like Yvonne is saying, new institutions, right? New methods of encounter, of response, of awareness, new at least to the modernist, legal order. And I think one of the major challenges is that this necessitates essentially an epistemological crisis for law, because like Yvonne was saying, we're very accustomed to bringing expert witnesses, but we're very unaccustomed to asking the land. We're very unaccustomed to encountering dreams. We're very unaccustomed to asking non-humans, or to listening to non-humans, or to become sensible to the maybe non-representational ways that non-humans are intervening or legislating. And legal anthropology, the ethnographic record, indigenous legal theorists, there's a large archive of the human variation of many different groups of people who engage in that way with the more than human world. And we were trying to bring by naming these challenges at the edge of ecological law, let's say, we were trying to put in we're trying to clear the way for the conversation between ecological law and indigenous legal theory more fully, to be able to really encounter each other, you know, without the stumbling blocks of, I mean, these stumbling blocks remain, but trying to at least name the stumbling blocks of epistemology, methodology, ontology at the interface between these things. So I'll leave it there. Unless, do you want to say something, Marie, or should we go to Colin?
Yeah, just to add very briefly, I think it's precisely one of the big limitations of modernist onto epistemologies or ontologies and epistemologies, precisely that we tend to limit the understanding of decision making to humans. While I think one of the contributions to the special issue by Margaret Davis, I find it so productive in thinking about what she speaks of ecological normativities. This is a way of conceiving decision-making by non-humans, let's say, which is also a mode of there are patterns in the metabolic processes of non-humans. There are certain habits, there are certain struggles, there are really modernist understandings of decision-making that we associate to human or social orders that are also enacted in non-human world or non-human or encounters between non-humans. And again, it's perhaps stretching it to the question of whether non-humans have an intention is perhaps too much, but there's definitely a normativity that is at stake. So I think indeed this is also a way you spoke, Josh, of a mode of legislating. I believe that non-humans are also, you know, there is a sense of legislating in their own ways. This is, you could interpret it or see it as a mode of decision making. So, yeah, I guess that was just an add-on.
Yeah, Colin, thank you. Thank you, Marie. You're muted.
Yeah, I was just listening here and thinking about this, the questions of decision making that Jeff raised, and the questions of representation, alternatives to representation, and I guess some sort of intuition that comes to me in relation to those questions is that in the Western intellectual tradition, when a division occurred between natural law as objective and social law as norm, something went off the rails, and if I think about this, I try to think about this ethnographically in the context of Indigenous interlocutors that have been involved in my work. Reciprocity is both what might translate into conventional Western frames as objective law for them, and at the same time normative law. So what does that mean, though, in practice? In practicing reciprocity with any other, human or not, it requires understanding what the other wants, or what the other needs, or what the other is asking for. So this issue of care comes into it very directly. And then I suppose that the procedures that are involved on the part of people I know do come to figuring these things out in all kinds of ways, and watching for in being so intimately engaged with others that one acquires a sense of what's required for a fulfillment of reciprocity. sometimes through ceremony, sometimes through dreams, and sometimes through things that look very much like rational empirical reason. It's I don't know that I know that I don't have a formula or a recipe that can really sum it up, but those are things that come to mind as I listen to this discussion.
If I may, unless somebody else wanted to pick up there, the purpose of this, one of the purposes from my point of view of this collaboration was also to signal the need to expand the boundaries of law beyond this representational register, right? To include other ways of engaging with decision making through dreams, through other kinds of practices. So in a way, I'm kind of echoing Margaret Davis, one of our contributors, an idea of law that is unlimited, an idea of law that goes beyond these boundaries, but also because law is also all about creating kind of territorializing different ways, creating especially property, for example. It's like a quintessential example of that. So what kind of law can emerge from a place of unlimited, imagination, and that includes this other. But the very practical question is depending on kind of the problems that we are facing with. Sometimes we might need a deliberation-oriented type of law. Sometimes we might need a law that is more based on storytelling. Sometimes we need a law that is more based on other kinds of sources. So it's a question of having all that available. Instead of casting out something to privilege something else. So it's all the relations in a way. I wanted to, Jeff, please. Mm-hmm.
I didn't want to cut you off, but I really like that idea of unlimited law. So it reminds me of this wonderful Wendell Berry essay, Faustian Economics, in which it's really about, he makes this analogy of our modern world, the pursuit of limitlessness, that with the Faust story, and he says we can learn some important lessons from art about the difference between limits and constraints. In that, a painting has a frame, and therefore is bounded. A story has a beginning and an end, at least in his conception of it. A piece of music has a beginning and an end, and yet there are unlimited possibilities for interpreting and performing or seeing those things. So, what this makes me think of is that the idea of limitlessness in our modern world, and I wonder if you can connect this to what you're saying in this book, is connected to these forms of remote decision making, foreign investment, the monetary systems that are so abstracted from reality, so abstracted from territoriality, from real places, real people, real ecosystems in all their diversity around the world, it seems to me that there's sort of a necessary connection between that kind of territoriality when you're looking at a posthuman legalities and the kind of legalities you're talking about here. Do you see that as kind of a necessary thing? That the intimacy then, both in the human communities and the interconnected human communities with place, as being sort of fundamental with the ideas that you're talking about in this book, and how that connects to this art and law is limitedness, is that I think when you're in place, there is a certain boundedness that sort of gets reflected into these interlegalities of place. Anyway, I just thought if you have any thoughts on that.
I think that, signaling the extreme abstraction, let's say, of international law and its institutions and treaties and circuits of materials. In many ways, that's the outgrowth of a sort of more fundamental abstraction, I guess, that we were trying to signal in the special issue of the ways in which logocentric Western legal order and modernist culture is seemingly sort of lost in the endless play of symbol, and finds it very difficult to enmesh itself in the intimacies of the wider semiotic field that isn't just human language. I think you signal an extremely difficult tension, which is how to maintain that intimacy, that ecological intimacy of human communities within a larger institutional network that needs to, in a global 8 billion person world, structure environmental law or law more generally, or so on. And I don't know the answer of how we maintain this bottom-up intimacy in a larger institutional setting, but it will necessarily require the more than reform of those institutions that seem to only exist in the symbolic world, and it becomes increasingly abstracted from non-human beings, and to the point where those non-human beings disappear beyond the horizon of even law that is oriented towards their protection, let's say. So I don't know, maybe Marie, you have something I see you scribbling away.
No, this is really a fascinating discussion, and my thoughts might be going in different directions here, but I guess when you speak about more than reform, and to link that a bit back to the point that Colin was making about reciprocity, I guess it's really not it's a bit a sense that is not really thought through, but I guess one sort of tension that I have with the notion of reciprocity, and correct me if I'm wrong, but is that there is always an expectation of mutual benefits, of gains, let's say, that are made through reciprocal relations, where at the end, the different actions of a relations come out beneficially through that relation. And I wonder if this is indeed precisely something that we should also try to overcome, in the sense that I find the notion and the practice of solidarity actually perhaps more useful in that regard, because solidarity is also, it opens up a form of engagement that goes beyond mutual benefits, that goes beyond immediate gains, that goes beyond something tangible, and that enables to also act within the world beyond recentering a bit the benefits towards oneself or others that are already predetermined. And I think this is precisely something where I find the notion of, can we dismantle, can we go beyond reform through relations of reciprocity? I'm not sure. And of course, I feel there is really a sort of active need for practices of unmaking, dismantling, something a bit that leads us elsewhere, perhaps. I don't know if that resonates, or if I'm really going on a tangent here.
Colin,
You're
please.
muted, Colin.
Yeah, I think you're muted. Yeah.
Thanks. I would say that reciprocity in the Indigenous context I'm thinking about goes well beyond mutual benefit. It is a logic for how the world works that is not all positive or rosy. That is, there's a continual dance as agents, subjects, agents, human and other than human, interact. There's a continual dance between positive reciprocity and negative reciprocity. And so politics and power are inherent in all of these relationalities. And people are continually learning what's required in terms of mutual benefit for there to be community, and also are learning the limits of the consequences of negative reciprocity, the consequences of taking more than one gives, for example. And people are continually looking at these things as, reading the world for the consequences of their actions in both those positive and negative registers. At that level, it's also, it dissolves the distinction between law and politics.
One of the things that makes me think of Colin is, among many of the, people who are often described as animist in the ethnographic record, one of the premises of that consciousness of the both positive and negative circuits of reciprocity is that the place of humans as not the predominant power within those circuits, and the dangers of broaching relational protocols, or the negative reciprocity that might, the consequences of that. And I think that this is one thing that is almost unspoken in ecological law is the required consequences, I guess, of really truly rethinking the place of the human, is the understanding of the human as not the center, which I think is often spoken, but also not the most powerful being, and not the being who will always benefit mutually from any environmental protection, right? The human circle might require the shouldering of radical consequences, both in the events that we're all becoming familiar with, fires and flooding and so on, but also the sort of moral and relational consequences that we seem to sort of that are not even legible, I guess, to modernist states. So those are my thoughts on that.
I don't know if anybody else wanted to say something. I see Peter open his mic. All right.
Can you hear me all right?
Hi.
Hi.
Hi, Peter.
It's been a wonderful discussion. I've read most of the book when it came out, and it's really absolutely essential that these ideas get broad hearings and bring about radical changes that are needed to salvage what is left of our planet. I read a book years ago by James Rachels about about the doctrine of about the Judeo-Christian doctrine of special creation, that humans are specially created in a separate manner by God, and that this brings, of course, a lot of other baggage with it. And I'm wondering how much of what's being talked about in this symposium that we're having would be very different if the doctrine of special creation was removed from current ontology and theology.
My sound is not cooperating, so I'm hitting a very choppy message at the end. But if I'm hearing correctly, Peter, I mean, in a way, although we don't explicitly engage with the religion or Genesis stories of the origin of things, we certainly believe, well, this is probably more, I believe that these kinds of works are doing first of all, sort of aligning with an ongoing conversation around repositioning the human, because we seems to be out of track again, and we need to be, I mean, you use the expression to salvage what is left. In a way, yeah, there's a very practical challenge. In order to salvage what is left, using your language, we need to reassess how we think ourselves in the context of larger living systems, and that is something that has a very transformative potential, and requires a lot of energy. Because it's a challenge at the level of education, at the level of learning. It's a challenge at the level of creating new institutions. It's a challenge of creating new concepts. And in a way, the law could be an entry point, as there are many others, to meet that challenge, which is an ontological challenge, but also a very practical one. So in the community, with the communities I work with in the Amazon, one important lesson that I have the opportunity to learn, is that in order to perceive differently, we need to unlearn what we know or what we believe we know. And unlearning can take a lot of energy, and it's very humbling, because we perceive with received categories of thought, and if we want to perceive otherwise, we need to suspend the very categories of thought that we use to describe, that mediate our perception of the world. So in a way, and that's precisely one of the last challenges that we identify in the special issue, has to do with imagining a law beyond the human, while necessarily engaging with the very categories of thought and language that at present continue to sustain conventional legal thinking and action: language of nature, rights, and property. So it is, if we want to really be serious about a law beyond the human, but we continue to using the language that enacts the very divisions that we want to overcome, we're probably doing a little to this impetus. So in a way, this is a call for a wild creation of concepts in the legal realm. And in a way, the contributors of this special edition are contributing also in that direction, by rethinking the genealogies of rights of nature, by reassessing the kind of assumed boundedness or discreteness of things in cosmos, and starting to think about law from the vantage point of relationships, by even challenging the idea of human rights. So things that we have received as good things, for what is left, using your terms, it's a huge challenge. So I know that we are running out of time, and well, we have almost 5 minutes, but if you wanted to, other people present in the room wanted to say something, wanted to share some of ideas. I know that this is a very interdisciplinary group. We have people working on ecological law, on anthropology. Well, this morning we learned about biocultural cartography in Panama, for example. Well, there are different entry points that are challenging this very idea of ontology of separation, and we can do that from many different entry points. And so if other people in the room want to say something, this is a safe space.
And perhaps while people are thinking about their last inputs, just to come back to this notion, I think that's the question that Peter raised. I think that's precisely, you know, I feel like dismantling or overcoming the doctrine of special creation is precisely what posthumanist theories are about. In a way, I mean, it is precisely, you know, you can think of it theologically, but it's also, if one reads the Laudato Si by Pope Francis, this is precisely a sort of a very explicit tackling of this issue. It's a different way of trying to take issues with the doctrine of special creation. So it is already happening in let's say by Pope Francis himself. Somehow he's trying to open up these debates. So and I think taken beyond the theological tradition or this religious realm within Christianity or Catholicism, the humility that comes with this exercise is precisely what posthumanist theories and posthumanist legalities are after, I would say. I mean, it's definitely something that I see very much embedded in these theories, almost like the starting point somehow.
If you look at Cree mythology, and we've talked about a bit about this, Peter, in the past, there's no singular beginning, and there seems to be no great need to think about a singular beginning. There are many creation stories, but they have to do with the transformation of animal-like people and people-like animals and spirit-like humans, and an ambiguity often about the entities involved, but then drawing out a tale about how some prior state comes to be some current state. But it all begins with already a fully populated universe, and no moment of Genesis, no Big Bang. It's just always been in process. I don't know if that's humility or just not giving a shit about certain kinds of questions. There was even in the early ethnography of Algonquian societies, there was this big question, big mystery about whether there was ever a singular God. That was debated, I think, without ever coming to resolution, because the Christianization of Algonquians at a certain point in history made it, and the coexistence of Christian mythology with indigenous mythology made it very difficult to settle that question. But certainly when you look at the texture of the indigenous narrative, it involves multiple personalities, human and other than human, from forever. Now you're muted, Peter.
Christian notion, as it was in the beginning, and ever shall, and now ever shall ever be.
Perhaps I can use this to summarize a concluding thought. I think what both you, Colin, and Peter are signaling is something that we were trying to gesture towards in the special issue, and that Aaron Mills, I think, writes very convincingly about, is that law is inseparable from lifeway. It's the expression or the emergence from a lifeway, and is inherently entangled in mythology, history, practices, and so on. And I mean, I think those things are not acknowledged, let's say, maybe by modernist legal orders, which sort of imagine themselves conjured into existence by rational minds, I guess. They obviously have their histories, particularly common law traditions, but they don't see themselves as enmeshed in larger mythological structures, you know, cosmologies and so on. And I think one of the things we're trying to tease out is both that modernist environmental law is enmeshed in a particular cosmology, or the expression of, and that if it needs to, if we're going to sufficiently transition it to something more appropriate to planetary boundaries and conditions, it's going to need to be able to question that cosmology and perhaps abandon it or transform it. So seeing as there's probably less than 1 minute, I'll just thank you all for coming. Thank you particularly, Marie, for joining us today at such a late hour for you. This was a really engaging discussion. I'm sure there's much more to be had in the future. So thank you for coming to the second book launch in the L4E series, and hopefully there will be a third with Katie Kish's collection, which regrettably had to be moved because of course, COVID-19. So thank you all, and I hope you have a good rest of whatever remaining portion of the day applies to you.